That morning, Matthew Cole entered the building through the side door, the way he always did. Blue uniform, maintenance cart, and in the left breast pocket, a small photograph of his 7-year-old daughter, still asleep alone at home. Nobody looked at him on the way in. Nobody needed to. He was the man who cleaned the floors. He was invisible. But at 1:58 that afternoon, the CEO's interpreter never showed up. The Hansung Pacific delegation was already seated. $50 million was waiting, and the only person in the building who spoke Korean was the man who had just finished mopping the floor they were all sitting on. People had looked past him for 14 months. It would cost them exactly one afternoon to regret it. Outside, Chicago was doing what it does in early spring. The wind off the lake pressing against the glass with a low, persistent authority. The sky still that particular shade of dark blue that is not quite night and not yet morning. Down on Michigan Avenue, the first delivery trucks were starting their runs. Up here on the 18th floor, none of that reached him. Just the hum of the building, and the sound of his own work, and the photograph in his pocket. In the left breast pocket of his uniform, the faded blue one with the small white logo of the building services company stitched above the chest, was a folded photograph. It was no bigger than a playing card. Bonnie at 6 years old, sitting on the front steps of their apartment building in Lincoln Park, laughing at something off camera. 2 front teeth missing, hair in 2 lopsided braids, because he had never quite mastered the technique. No matter how many videos he watched, he kept the photo there every shift. It was the kind of small, private ritual that kept a man tethered when everything else was noise. Matthew Cole was 36 years old. He was 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, quiet build that comes not from vanity, but from years of carrying weight, physical and otherwise. His hands were rough at the palms from the mop handle, and there was a faint old ink stain on the inside of his left index finger that no amount of soap had ever fully erased. It was the mark of someone who had once signed documents every single day. Contracts, translation certifications, classified briefings. For 8 years, Matthew had worked as a military interpreter for the Department of Defense. Korean. Level 4. One of fewer than 300 people in the country who held that certification at the highest grade. He had sat across from generals and trade ministers, in basement conference rooms in Seoul, and in glass towers in Washington, and he had translated not just words but intention, the careful architecture of meaning that exists between what people say and what they actually want. He had left all of that in 2021. His wife, Clara, had been diagnosed in January and gone by October. Bonnie was 4 years old. The choice had not been a choice at all. Private interpretation work dried up faster than he had expected. The freelance market for high-level Korean interpreters was narrow, and the agencies that paid well required travel, extended trips, short notice calls, long stretches away from home. None of that was possible with a 4-year-old who woke up some nights calling for a mother who was no longer there. So he had taken what was available: building services, steady hours, no surprises, a paycheck that landed on time every 2 weeks, enough to cover the apartment, Bonnie's school, the small savings account he added to when he could. He did not complain about any of it. Complaining required energy better spent elsewhere. The building services company paid him $19 an hour. It was not what he had earned before. It was not what he was worth, by any reasonable measure. But worth and wage were different calculations, and he had long since stopped confusing the two. What the job gave him was a schedule Bonnie could count on, a building close enough to her school that he could walk her there on mornings when he had the earlier shift, and the quiet dignity of doing a job well, regardless of who was watching. He had never believed that the quality of a person's work was inversely proportional to the prestige of the work itself. He had met too many important people doing important things badly to believe that. This particular Tuesday, he had arrived early to prepare the 18th floor for a major event. The conference room at the east end of the hall, the large one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, was set for an afternoon negotiation. He had arranged the chairs the night before, and this morning he buffed the surface of the long table until it reflected the ceiling lights like still water. He checked the projector cables, straightened the stacks of printed documents laid out by someone from the administrative team. He did not read them. They were not his to read. He pushed his cart toward the service elevator and pressed the button for the 15th floor. He did not expect to see the inside of that conference room again. That was not part of his schedule. What happened next was not part of anyone's schedule. Eleanor Voss had been awake since 3 in the morning. This was not unusual for her, but the reason this particular morning was different. She had not simply woken early to review reports or return emails. She had lain in the dark of her apartment on the 32nd floor of a building 3 blocks away and stared at the ceiling with the particular kind of wakefulness that has nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with knowing exactly what is at stake. Hansung Pacific. That was what kept her awake. Eleanor was 38 years old, and she had built Voss Capital Group from a regional investment advisory firm into one of the most respected mid-size capital management companies in the Midwest. She had done it through a combination of precision, patience, and the willingness to make decisions that other people spent weeks agonizing over. She was not reckless. She was clear. There was a difference. And not everyone who worked for her understood that distinction, but the ones who stayed long enough eventually did. The Hansung Pacific deal was the largest single transaction in Voss Capital's history. $50 million in structured logistics investment across 3 years, opening a corridor into the East Asian distribution market that Eleanor had been quietly building toward for 2 full years. If the deal closed, it would redefine the company's trajectory. It would also silence the members of the board who had, 6 weeks earlier, voted to restrict her unilateral signing authority pending what they described as a period of strategic review. Eleanor understood what that meant. It meant they were watching, and watching meant she could not afford a single visible stumble. She walked into the building at 7 in the morning, dressed in a black blazer over a white shirt, hair pulled back neatly, reading the overnight briefing on her phone. Sophia Grant, her executive assistant, was already at her desk outside the corner office, holding a printed copy of the morning summary and a cup of coffee. Richard Harlan arrived 11 minutes later, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had not yet had a reason to doubt himself today. He was 44, well-dressed, and had held the title of Vice President of Business Development at Voss Capital for 6 years. He was effective mostly. He was also a person who had never once in his career been in a room where he felt he was not the most important person present, and this had shaped him in ways he was not fully aware of. He told Eleanor the interpreter was confirmed. Daniel Marsh, a professional Korean interpreter with 12 years of experience in corporate negotiation contexts. Richard had hired him 2 weeks prior. The contract was signed. Everything was in order. Eleanor nodded and said nothing unnecessary. Sophia handed her a second memo. Eleanor took it, but her eyes tracked Richard for a moment longer than they needed to. She had learned to notice when people spoke in the language of certainty. It was often the final thing they said before something went wrong. At 11:47 in the morning, with 2 hours and 13 minutes before the Hansung Pacific delegation was scheduled to arrive, Sophia's phone rang. She answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was strained, with the particular flattening of pain that people use when they are trying to sound composed and are not succeeding. It was Daniel Marsh. He had been in a collision on the interstate that morning. His car was totaled. He was in the emergency room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He was not seriously injured, he said, as though this were the most important piece of information. He could not make the 2 o'clock meeting. Sophia sat very still for 3 seconds. Then she stood up and walked directly to Eleanor's office and opened the door without knocking, which she had done only twice before in 4 years. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. What were the alternatives? Sophia had already started making calls on the walk from her desk. Two of Chicago's three major professional interpretation agencies had no one available on 2 hours' notice. The third had a Korean interpreter, but he was in Boston and could not fly in time. A freelancer Eleanor's team had used once before was reachable but unavailable until evening. There was no viable professional option left. Richard, who had been summoned by text and arrived at Eleanor's doorway still buttoning his jacket, offered the suggestion of using real-time translation software supplemented by a bilingual junior staff member. Eleanor looked at him in a way that did not require words. They both knew that Theodore Wu, the head of the Hansung Pacific delegation, had walked out of a negotiation with a German firm the previous year specifically because they had attempted exactly that approach. He had sent a single written statement afterward, saying that he considered the use of machine translation in face-to-face negotiations to be a form of institutional disrespect. That statement had circulated through every corporate development office on the North American side of the Pacific Trade Corridor within a week. The 18th floor began to hum with the particular energy of controlled panic. Assistants moved in tighter circuits. Voices dropped lower. Two senior associates stepped out of their offices and then stepped back in, sensing that whatever was happening was above their level of involvement. Matthew Cole was pushing his service cart back down the hall toward the 11th floor when he slowed, without quite knowing why. The conference room door was not fully latched. Through the gap, he could hear fragments of a conversation. Eleanor's voice, clipped and precise. Sophia's voice, faster than usual. And beneath both of them, the unmistakable sound of a situation without a solution. He heard the word interpreter. He heard the word Korean. He heard the phrase 2 hours. He stopped. His hands were on the cart handle. He looked down the hall in one direction, then the other. There was no one else nearby. He stood there for perhaps 6 seconds, long enough to think through what he was about to do and to recognize that it was probably inadvisable, and then he reached up and knocked on the conference room door. The room went still when he stepped inside. Eleanor was standing at the head of the table. Sophia was near the window, phone still in her hand. Richard was by the door to the adjoining prep room, and when he turned and saw Matthew the uniform, the cart outside in the hallway, his expression settled into something immediately dismissive. Matthew did not wait for an introduction. He said, calmly and without preamble, that he had heard they needed a Korean interpreter. Richard told him to step out. Matthew did not step out. He reached into the front pocket of his uniform and produced his phone. On the screen was a photograph of a Department of Defense Interpreter Certification, Level 4, Korean language, issued in 2013, renewed annually through 2021. He placed the phone on the edge of the table. He said he had spent 8 years interpreting for the Pentagon. He said he had handled commercial treaty negotiations, bilateral logistics agreements, and 2 separate rounds of trade discussions involving Hansung Pacific's regional subsidiary in Busan. He said the last part without emphasis, the way a person states a fact they know will land without needing to be underscored. The room was quiet. Sophia moved to her phone. Within 90 seconds, she had pulled up a LinkedIn profile that had not been updated in several years, but was still live and still legible. 8 years with the Department of Defense. Departure date in the autumn of 2021. The description under his role read, Senior Interpreter, Korean and Japanese, Diplomatic and Commercial Negotiations. The profile had no activity, no connections recently added, no recent posts. It looked like what it was, a record of a career that had been set down and not picked back up. Sophia showed Eleanor the screen. She said quietly that the profile appeared genuine. Richard pulled Eleanor aside, speaking low enough that the words were not quite meant to carry, but they did. He told her she could not bring a janitor into a $50 million negotiation. He told her this was the company's biggest deal of the year and that it was not the time for social experiments. He told her Theodore Wu would see the uniform, or at least would sense something off, and they would lose the deal before the first clause was discussed. Eleanor let him finish. Then she looked at Matthew. She asked him one question. She asked why he had knocked on the door. Matthew was quiet for a moment. It was a real pause, the kind that happens when a person is sorting truth from presentation and deciding to offer only the truth. He said he had been in rooms like this one before. He said he knew what it cost when a single mistranslation unraveled a deal that two sides had spent months building toward. He said he did not want to watch that happen if he could stop it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sophia. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. She asked Matthew if he owned a suit. He said no. She turned to Sophia and told her to find him one. The suit came from the closet of a former associate who had left a spare jacket and trousers in the building after a late-night event 2 years earlier. It fit Matthew with the kind of accidental precision that feels almost arranged. He changed in the staff restroom on the 18th floor, and before he buttoned the jacket, he took the photograph of Bonnie from the breast pocket of his uniform and transferred it to the inside pocket of the borrowed blazer. He had no particular reason to examine the face in the mirror. He looked at himself once, briefly, and recognized someone he had not seen in a while. He sent a text message to his neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, asking if she could collect Bonnie from school at 3:30. Then he walked back down the hall to the conference room. The Hansung Pacific delegation arrived at 1:58 in the afternoon. Theodore Wu came through the elevator doors first. He was 52 years old, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of physical economy that signals a person who conserves energy for when it counts. Behind him came Charles Min, the delegation's lead contract attorney, carrying a slim leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional neutrality so refined it was almost architectural. Eleanor greeted them at the elevator. The introductions were formal, measured. When she turned to include Matthew, she gave his name without a title, without context, without explanation. Matthew extended his hand to Theodore Wu and spoke 4 sentences in Korean. The phrasing was formal and precise, in the register appropriate for senior executives at an initial high-stakes meeting, not overfamiliar, not stiff, but calibrated to exactly the level of respect the moment required. Theodore Wu shook his hand, and then did something he had not done since arriving in the building. He paused. He looked at Matthew directly, the way a person looks when they are revising an impression they had already formed. Charles Min offered a slightly deeper bow than he had given Eleanor, which was notable only to someone paying attention. Richard, standing at the perimeter of the greeting, was paying attention. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. The delegation took their seats. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, with Sophia positioned to her right, tablet ready. Richard took a chair along the side. Matthew sat at the corner of the table between Eleanor and the Hansung delegation, where an interpreter naturally positions close enough to translate without delay, angled, so that neither party had to look past him to see each other. The opening exchange was formal. Eleanor presented the framework of the proposed partnership. Matthew translated each section fluidly, and in doing so he made adjustments that were invisible to everyone except Theodore Wu, shifting the directness of Eleanor's American corporate cadence into the more layered, relationship-conscious register that Korean business culture treats not as evasion but as appropriate weight-bearing language. He did not change the substance of anything Eleanor said. He changed the architecture around it, the way a good translator always does, so that what arrived on the other side of the language barrier carried the same meaning but arrived correctly dressed. Theodore Wu listened. He interjected occasionally in Korean, and Matthew translated those responses back to Eleanor without pause or hesitation. 40 minutes into the session, they arrived at the clause that Matthew had flagged that morning in the prep room, the profit-sharing provision for year 1 of the partnership. The English language draft read as an even split. The corresponding Korean language version, drafted by Hansung's legal team, used a term of art that carried a default assumption of priority weighting toward the originating party in the first fiscal period. It was not a dramatic discrepancy, and it was not necessarily intentional. These kinds of asymmetries accumulated in complex bilingual contracts, the way small miscalibrations accumulate in long calculations. But if it went unaddressed and was later discovered after signatures had been exchanged, it would become the foundation for a dispute that would cost both parties far more than it was worth. Charles Min read the clause aloud from his version. Richard was nodding before the translation was complete, the way someone nods when they are processing the sound of words rather than their meaning. Matthew placed one hand flat on the table. He said calmly that he needed to pause and clarify one point before they moved on. He addressed Charles Min directly in Korean, without routing through Eleanor, which was the correct protocol when an interpreter identifies an internal discrepancy. He pointed to the specific phrase in the Korean text and explained, in precise legal Korean, how it differed functionally from the English parallel clause and what the downstream implications of that difference would be. The room went very quiet. Charles Min looked at his copy of the document. Then he looked at Theodore Wu and said something in Korean. Very short. Theodore Wu said something back. Equally short. Then Theodore Wu looked at Matthew and asked him, in Korean, how he had known to catch that. Matthew answered him in Korean, without performing the answer. He said he had been in enough rooms like this one to know the difference between an oversight and an intention, and that it mattered which one it was. There was a pause that lasted slightly longer than a normal conversational pause. Then, Theodore Wu did something that everyone at the table noticed, though they interpreted it differently depending on what they understood. He smiled. It was not the polished professional smile of a man at a negotiating table. It was something else, the brief, real expression of a person who has been surprised by a quality they did not expect to encounter. He nodded once. Richard looked down at the table. During the short recess that followed, while Sophia escorted the Hansung delegation to the adjacent lounge, Richard positioned himself beside Matthew near the window. His voice was low and controlled, but there was something underneath it that the control was failing to fully contain. He told Matthew not to misread what was happening. He told him that whatever he was doing in that room today, it did not change anything. When the meeting was over, he said Matthew would go back to his actual job. He suggested that Matthew not get ahead of himself. Matthew looked at him. He was not angry. He was not defensive. He had heard versions of this speech before in the military, in government offices, in spaces where people with credentials and access felt that presence itself was a form of encroachment. He had always found it more exhausting than wounding. He said, without sharpness, that he knew exactly who he was, and that the question seemed to be whether Richard knew what he actually needed right now. Then he walked back toward the door of the conference room. The second half of the session was more complex. Theodore Wu introduced a provision that had not appeared in any of the preliminary drafts, a structured exit clause permitting Hansung Pacific to withdraw from the agreement within the first 18 months. If specified logistics, performance benchmarks were not met by a defined threshold. It was a significant addition. And it was timed in a way that made clear it was deliberate rather than incidental. Eleanor had not been briefed on this clause. There was no preparation for it. She received Matthew's translation and held a composed face. But her stillness was the stillness of someone buying time. In the half-second between finishing the translation and turning to wait for Eleanor's response, Matthew added 3 sentences at a near whisper, addressed only to her. He said this type of exit provision was standard in Hansung Pacific's partnership agreements with Asian market collaborators. He said it was not a trap. He said it was a test that the party willing to accept it was the party they considered a genuine long-term partner, because it demonstrated confidence in execution over contractual protection. Eleanor received this information. She looked at Matthew for slightly less than a second. Then she turned to Theodore Wu and said, steadily, that Voss Capital accepted the provision. Theodore Wu closed his copy of the documents. He spoke to Charles Min in Korean, a single sentence. Matthew translated it into English for Eleanor. His voice even. He said that Theodore Wu had told his colleague. They had found the right person. Richard did not look up from the table for a long moment after that. The memorandum of understanding was signed at 4:37 in the afternoon, in the same conference room where Matthew had laid out chairs and polished the table surface 9 hours earlier. Theodore Wu signed first, then Eleanor. Charles Min witnessed. Sophia documented. When it was done, Theodore Wu stood and looked at Matthew across the table. He spoke in Korean. Matthew translated for the room without inflection. The professional neutral register of someone who does not editorialize, even when the words are about them. He told Eleanor that Theodore Wu wanted him present for the full contract negotiations scheduled for the following month. Eleanor said that could be arranged. After the delegation had been escorted to the elevator and the conference room had emptied, it was just Eleanor and Matthew, and the long table between them, and the low afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows, and the particular silence of a room in which something definitive has just happened. Richard left without speaking. The door closed behind him, with the quiet firmness of a man who understands that the conversation he needed to have would have to wait for a different day. Eleanor sat down. Not in her usual posture at the head of the table, not the posture of the CEO reviewing outcomes, but further along the side, leaned slightly back in the chair the way a person sits when the performance is finished, and what remains is just the person. She looked tired. The real kind. She asked Matthew why he had left the government work. He sat down too, not across from her but beside her, at an angle, the way two people sit when they are not having a meeting. He told her his wife had passed in 2021. He said it without preface or qualification. He said Bonnie had been 4 years old. There was nothing else that needed to be said about the logic of it. Eleanor received the information the way a person receives weight quietly, without deflecting it. She looked at his hands on the table, the calluses at the base of each finger, the old ink mark on the left index finger that she could see from where she was sitting. She said he had walked away from a significant career to clean floors. He said no. He had walked away from a career to raise his daughter. The floors were just a job. The distinction was small and absolute. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She folded her hands on the table, looked out the window at the city below, and said nothing. Sophia knocked and opened the door. She said the delegation was ready for their farewell and that the car service had been confirmed. Eleanor stood. Matthew stood. He looked down at the borrowed suit jacket. He said he should return it. Eleanor told him to wear it for the rest of the afternoon. What happened to Richard Harlan in the days that followed was not dramatic. Eleanor did not summon him to her office for a confrontation. There was no formal reprimand, no raised voice, no moment of theater. What there was, instead, was a quiet reorganization. Within the week, following the board's review of the Hansung outcome, Richard was reassigned to head the Domestic Portfolio Advisory Team, a position with a title, but no seat at the company's primary growth table. It was not termination. It was recalibration. Eleanor operated that way. She did not punish. She arranged. Sophia told Matthew about the reassignment in passing, on a Thursday afternoon in the hallway outside the administrative suite. Matthew received the information and said only that he hoped Richard found the new role useful. He meant it. He had no appetite for anyone's diminishment. The formal contract negotiation with Hansung Pacific was scheduled for the following month. Eleanor had already begun the process of formalizing Matthew's position within the company Director of East Asia Partnership Relations, a title with a contract, a salary, and a scope of responsibilities that extended well beyond a single afternoon. 8 days after the signing, a small, cream-colored envelope arrived addressed to Eleanor. Inside was a business card and a single handwritten note on thin paper in a precise hand. The note was written in Korean. Eleanor brought it to Matthew. He read it standing in the doorway of her office, the late afternoon sun coming in from behind him. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then he translated. He told her that Theodore Wu had written that a skilled interpreter does not translate words. They translate the intentions of people. He said that Wu had thanked her for sending the right person. Eleanor took the note from him carefully and folded it along its original crease. She opened the upper right drawer of her desk and placed it inside, and she closed the drawer without comment. On Friday of that same week, Matthew left the Voss Capitol building at 5:32 in the evening. He took the main entrance, the wide glass doors facing Michigan Avenue, rather than the side entrance he had used every morning for 14 months. The doorman nodded at him. He nodded back. He walked the 3 blocks to the parking structure, and on his way, he passed the ground floor window of the building services office, where a cart identical to his old one was parked just inside the door, its mop handle leaning against the wall. He looked at it for a moment without stopping. Bonnie was at home with Mrs. Wilson when he arrived. She was sitting on the kitchen floor in her pajamas, even though it was only 6 in the evening, arranging a collection of bottle caps into a pattern that made sense to her. When the door opened, she looked up and said, without preliminary, that he looked different. He asked her how. She said she didn't know. Just different. He sat down on the floor beside her, loosened the tie he had been wearing, and looked at the bottle cap arrangement. He asked her what she was building. She said it wasn't building. It was organizing. He said he understood the distinction. Later that night, after Bonnie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Matthew sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and nothing else. No phone. No documents. Just the small sounds of the building around him, the pipes, the neighbor's television through the wall, the occasional passing car. He thought about Eleanor Voss in her glass office, above a city that had no idea she was exhausted. He thought about Theodore Wu's handwriting, precise and considered, on thin paper. He thought about Charles Min's slight adjustment of his bow, the fraction of a degree that meant something, even if most people in the room had not seen it. He thought about Richard Harlan, and how a man could spend decades learning to read a room and still miss the thing that mattered most in it. He thought about Clara, the way he always did at the end of the days that would have been worth describing to her. He thought about Bonnie, asleep in the next room, who had looked up from her bottle caps and said he seemed different, and then gone back to her organizing without asking for an explanation. Children did not need explanations. They needed presence. They needed someone to sit down on the floor beside them and take the world seriously in small increments. He had been invisible in that building for 14 months. He had moved through its hallways without name, without acknowledgement, without weight. He had cleaned the surfaces on which other people's decisions were made and gone home before the decisions were announced. That was the whole of it. And then one door had been left slightly ajar, and something had shifted. He did not know, sitting at that kitchen table, whether what had shifted would hold. The contract was not yet signed. The formal negotiations were 30 days away. The world had a long history of correcting for anomalies, restoring people to the position it had decided they occupied, regardless of what they had demonstrated. But he had been in that room. He had sat at that table. He had watched a $50 million agreement find its footing, because he understood that the space between 2 languages is not empty. It is full of everything that cannot be said directly, and it takes a particular kind of attention to hear it. He was still the same person who had arrived with a mop cart at 5:20 that morning. He was still the same person whose daughter kept him awake at night sometimes by calling out in her sleep for someone who was no longer there to answer. He was still the man who transferred a worn photograph from one pocket to another and never left home without it. None of that had changed. The only thing that had changed was that one person in a position to see him had finally looked. He picked up his phone and sent a single text message to Sophia. He would be there at 8 in the morning. Then he turned off the kitchen light and walked down the short hallway and stood for a moment in the doorway of Bonnie's room. She was asleep on her side, one arm draped over the edge of the mattress, fingers open. The small sound of her breathing filled the room completely. He stood there for a while, not doing anything. Just present. Just there. That was, in the end, the whole of it. A man who had spent his career translating the space between people had learned, slowly, at significant cost, that the most important thing was not what you said into that space. It was whether you showed up for the person on the other side of it. He had shown up. That was enough for now. In the morning, he would walk through the main entrance again. He would take the elevator to the 18th floor. He would sit at a desk that now had his name on a printed card outside the door, not building services, not staff, but his name. And he would begin the work of preparing for the most important professional negotiation of his second career. He would do it with the same attention he had brought to every task in that building, because that was not something that changed with the quality of the chair you were sitting in. And somewhere in the pocket of his jacket, folded small, Bonnie would be laughing with 2 missing teeth and lopsided braids, quietly holding everything together the way she always had, without knowing it, without needing to.